I think that there were Dickinson poems, there were poems by Edna St. Vincent Millay, there were poems by E. Cummings. There was a book I encountered called Coney Island of the Mind by Lawrence Ferlinghetti, which a friend bought it for me because we skipped school and we went to a bookstore, which showed both how hard we were trying to be rebellious, but what nerds we were. So it was my half birthday, and she bought this book and handed it to me, and she said, "Happy half birthday." And because it was contemporary, it was just out in that year, which I think was maybe, 64? And it gave me this window onto what poetry was going to be now, this poetry, opposed to Dickinson, for instance, or Whitman or Wordsworth. And so because my reading was so eclectic and I had all these pieces to it, I've always been that kind of reader and been open to a lot of different styles and strategies, and I never got trapped into only liking formal poetry or only liking the poetry of the past. So I'm glad about that, and I think that book, Coney Island of the Mind, was key for me. I'm working on a manuscript. It's almost finished. It's called The Last 2 Seconds. And in some ways it just represents all the poems I've written since I published a book called The Bride of E. And in fact, I rather worried whether they all fit together because I hadn't intended necessarily for them to go into a manuscript. But when I printed them out, I saw that, in fact, my preoccupations and obsessions continue over time, and so I shouldn't be surprised, because I always tell my students that's the fact, that one's preoccupations and obsessions will, find a way into the poems, but they have. I think there are two through lines. One is a kind of anxiety that I feel like the world has created more recently. I mean, I guess the world has always been the world, complex and adamant, but I think that in the past I've been more interested in mining some kind of vexed interiority, and now I feel that a lot of the poems also mine the speaker's anxiety about the world. So I think that one way to think about the collection is that there's a speaker, and sometimes she's vexed about the world, and sometimes she's just vexed. So whereas before I think there was the speaker who was just vexed. I think that I learn from criticism of other people's work, and particularly when I have to critique that work, and whether it's something contemporary and I'm writing a review, or whether it's something about a poem of the past. But I think what happens when you bring that kind of attention, that level of attention to a poem, is you begin to delight in how a poem works. And I think that those are formal elements, but you can't tease apart with a poem form and content. And I think that often, if we're reading casually, it's the content that we take in and we react to. But I think that when you really have to scrutinize a poem to see how that content has become expressive in some way, that there are different levels of delight and interest, and you can appreciate a poem that perhaps you weren't really drawn to that subject area, but now you are in awe of how somebody put that poem together, and you realize that only that person could have put it together in that way.